the settlement of Providence huddled in a crease of the vast, unforgiving land, a place where survival was a constant, low hum beneath the noise of daily life. Its cabins were sturdy, uniform things, each a testament to the hard-won battle against the wilderness. They stood with their backs to the looming mountains and their faces to the endless plains, and from the roof of every single one, a stone chimney rose like a stubborn fist clenched against the sky. Every cabin, that is, except for one. Anyar's cabin sat slightly apart from the rest, on a small rise where the winter sun lingered last. It was smaller than the others, built with the same rough-hewn logs, but it was conspicuously incomplete. It had no chimney. No dark plume of smoke ever rose from its roof to join the others in their dance against the pale, cold air. This absence was more than a curiosity, it was a wound in the fabric of the community's understanding. A cabin without a heart of fire was a tomb waiting for winter to seal it. Anyar had arrived the previous spring, a solitary figure trailing a history she never spoke of. Her husband had bought the plot of land before a fever took him, leaving her with a half-finished shell and a silence that seemed to have settled deep into her bones. The people of Providence, in their gruff and guarded way, had offered help. They had offered to finish the chimney, to install the heavy iron stove that was the birthright of every frontier home. She had thanked them with a quiet dip of her head and a softness in her eyes, but she had refused. "I have my own way," she had said, and the words were so gentle they were almost lost on the breeze, yet they built a wall as surely as if she had laid the stones herself. Now, autumn was bleeding its color from the aspen groves, and the air had a new, sharp edge to it. The men were splitting wood, the sound of their axes a frantic heartbeat counting down the days. The women were packing tallow into seams, stuffing moss into the chinks between logs, their faces tight with a familiar, ancestral anxiety. And they all watched Anyar. They watched her as she moved with a strange, unhurried purpose. She did not chop wood. Her woodpile was a small, almost laughable mound of dried branches and fallen limbs, barely enough to last a week, let alone a brutal mountain winter. Instead, she spent her days by the creek, hauling buckets of heavy, blue-gray clay. She gathered smooth, flat stones from the riverbed, stacking them in careful piles. She dug sand from a particular bend in the creek, sifting it through her fingers. They saw the work, but they could not comprehend its meaning. It was the work of a child building a play fort, not a woman preparing for the long dark. The whispers started in the dry goods store, then moved to the church steps, low and concerned. "Grief has unsettled her mind," Sarah Bartlett murmured to her husband, her hands deep in a sack of flour. "She'll not survive it. We can't let her perish from pride." Her husband, Bartlett, a man whose certainty was as solid as the granite hills, just shook his head, his jaw tight. "I've tried. She won't listen. A person has a right to their own folly, I suppose," but his eyes betrayed a deeper unease. It felt wrong. It felt like a defiance of the natural order, of the sacred covenant between man and winter. You feed the fire, and the fire lets you live. Anyar's cabin, silent and smokeless, was a question nobody knew how to ask, and a tragedy they all felt certain they would soon have to witness. The first frost came like a thief in the night, laying a brittle, silver blanket over the world. It was a warning shot from the advancing army of winter. In the cabins of Providence, stoves were lit before dawn, their iron bodies groaning as they fought back the biting cold that seeped through the walls. The air filled with the comforting, resinous smell of burning pine. Children were bundled in extra layers, their breath pluming in the chilly indoor air. But from Anyar's cabin, there was still nothing. No smoke, no sign of life save for her own steady movements as she continued her strange work. Bartlett, driven by a mixture of civic duty and a nagging, personal vexation, finally decided he could not stand it any longer. He found a spare stove plate in his shed, heavy and rusted but whole, and carried it over to her rise. He found her not inside, but behind her cabin, mixing clay, sand, and dried grasses with her bare hands in a shallow wooden trough. Her hands were caked in mud, her face smudged, but her eyes were clear and calm. "Anyar," he began, his voice louder than he intended, setting the iron plate down with a thud. "This has to stop. It's foolishness. Take this. We can have a stovepipe fitted through your roof by noon." She looked from the stove plate to his face, and for a moment, he saw a flicker of something, not anger, but a deep, weary patience. She wiped a hand on her apron, leaving a streak of grey. "You are a kind man, Mr. Bartlett," she said, her voice even. "But I have told you. I have my own way." He gestured widely at her small, inadequate woodpile. That is not a way. That is a death sentence. What are you doing with all this mud?" She looked toward the cabin, a silent invitation. He followed her inside, his boots loud on the floorboards. The interior was sparse and clean, but the center of the room was dominated by a bizarre structure. A long, low, serpentine bench made of river stones and packed earth snaked from the middle of the room to the far wall. It was waist-high, flat on top, and felt strangely solid, like a piece of the landscape had been brought indoors. At one end, near the center, was a small, brick-lined opening, no bigger than a breadbox. At the other end, a narrow clay pipe went up and vented through a small hole in the log wall, far below the roofline. It looked like an altar to some forgotten god. It looked like nothing he had ever seen. "This is my stove," she said simply. Bartlett stared, his mind failing to connect what he saw with what he knew of heat and fire and survival. There was no grate, no large firebox, no chimney to create a drawer. The thing was massive, solid. "That won't draw air," he said, the certainty returning to his voice. "The smoke will fill the room. You'll choke before you freeze." She shook her head gently. "The smoke will not be much. And it will not stay. It will travel." She traced a slow path with her finger along the top of the winding bench. "It will travel all the way through, and leave its warmth in the stone before it goes." He could only stare. It was madness. He had brought logic and iron, a proven tool of survival, and she was answering with mud and riddles. He felt a surge of frustration, the kind a man feels when faced with a stubbornness that transcends all reason. "The Reverend Miller is right," he said, his tone hardening. "Grief has taken your sense." He left the stoveplate by her door, a final, useless offering. As he walked back to his own cabin, to the reassuring sight of smoke billowing from his chimney, he felt a grim certainty settle over him. He was a practical man. He knew the rules of this world. And Anya, the quiet widow, was breaking every single one of them. Inside the cabin, Anya paid his departure no mind. The world outside, with its whispers and its certainties, had grown distant. Her world was here, in the quiet, focused labor of her hands. The structure she was building was a memory, a piece of the old country carried across an ocean and a continent. She called it the Kotao, the heart. In her homeland, the winters were just as fierce, but the forests were not endless. Wood was precious, to be used with wisdom, not devoured by roaring, inefficient fires that sent most of their heat straight up a chimney to warm the uncaring sky. Her grandfather had taught her the principles. Fire, he'd said, was a wild spirit. An open hearth let it dance and flee. A stove trapped it in an iron cage, where it raged and burned out quickly. But the Kotao did something different. It tamed the fire. It made it work. It coaxed the heat from the smoke itself, pulling every last ounce of warmth from a handful of fuel and storing it in a dense, earthen body. The construction was nearly complete. She had spent weeks laying the stones, her hands raw from the weight and the grit. She had mixed the clay mortar to the perfect consistency, feeling for the right balance of stickiness and strength, just as her mother had taught her. The long, winding channel inside the bench was the secret. The hot smoke from the small firebox would not rush upwards. It would be forced to travel the long, slow, horizontal path, its heat seeping into the stones and the packed earth along the way. By the time the smoke finally exited the pipe in the wall, it would be cool to the touch, having surrendered its energy to the thermal mass of the bench. The Kotao would become a reservoir of heat, a giant, warm stone that would radiate a gentle, steady warmth for hours, even days, after the fire itself was nothing but embers. She worked without haste, her movements economical and precise. She plastered the final layer of clay, smoothing it with a wet piece of leather until the surface was seamless and soft to the touch. It was not just a heater, it was a piece of furniture. It was a warm bench to sit on, a flat surface for proving bread, a place to dry herbs. It was the center of the home, a silent, steady presence. When she was finished, she stood back and surveyed her work. The late afternoon sun streamed through the single, small window opening, which was covered by a stretched and oiled piece of hide, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The earthen heart sat in the center of it all, waiting. It was her defiance, her anchor, her faith. It was a testament to a different kind of knowledge, a quieter, more patient wisdom than the brute force logic of her neighbors. She laid a small fire in the firebox, using only a few pieces of the dry kindling from her meager pile. She did not use logs. She used branches, twigs, dried pine cones, the scraps the others ignored. The fire caught quickly, a bright, clean flame. She watched, her heart beating a steady rhythm. The smoke did not billow into the room. It was drawn sluggishly, almost reluctantly, into the winding flue. She placed her hand on the surface of the bench near the firebox. Nothing. It was still cold as stone. She waited. This was the test. Not of the stone and clay, but of her memory, of her faith in the old ways. An hour passed. She added a few more branches. The fire burned with a low, contained roar. She placed her hand on the bench again. This time, a faint, deep warmth bled into her palm. It was barely perceptible, but it was there. It was working. A slow smile touched her lips. She was not mad. She was not lost. She was home. The community's concern soon curdled into a kind of resentful pity. Bartlett had told everyone about the mud altar inside Anyar's cabin, his story painting a picture of a woman thoroughly unmoored by sorrow. His words confirmed their worst fears. She was not just unprepared, she was actively courting disaster with some strange, foreign nonsense. Reverend Miller felt it was his duty to intervene. He was a stern man, his faith as hard and unyielding as the winter ground, but he believed his duty was to all souls in his parish, even the lost ones. He walked up the rise to her cabin one afternoon, his Bible held tight in his hand. He found her outside, sweeping the dust from her doorstep. "Mrs. Anyar," he began, his voice devoid of its usual Sunday warmth. "The community is worried for you. Mr. Bartlett tells me you have built an unconventional hearth." She stopped sweeping and looked at him, her gaze direct. "It is the way of my people, Reverend. It is enough. His voice rose slightly. "Woman, look at these mountains. God's power is in that cold. He provides us with forests of wood and the good sense to burn it hot and fast. To turn your back on such providence is a form of pride. It is to say your way is better than the one that has sustained us all." He saw it as a spiritual failing, a refusal to accept the established wisdom that was, in his mind, divinely sanctioned. Her quiet persistence was an affront. It was a pebble of doubt cast into the still pool of their collective truths. "My way does not waste his gifts, Reverend," she replied, her tone respectful but unbending. "It honors them. It holds them close." Her simple words were like a foreign language to him. He saw only a woman clinging to a foolish, earthen idol while the very real threat of a deadly winter gathered on the horizon. He spoke of Scripture, of the need for fellowship and of accepting the help of one's neighbors. He warned her that a spirit of isolation was a doorway for despair. She listened patiently, her hands clasped in front of her. When he was done, she simply said, "I thank you for your concern for my soul, Reverend. I will pray for us all." He left her cabin feeling profoundly disturbed. He had come to save a lost sheep and had found himself speaking to a stone wall. Her calm was more unsettling than any frantic grief. That evening, the men gathered at the store, the air thick with the smell of pipe tobacco and impending snow. "She'll be our burden before the first real storm," one man grumbled. "We'll be the ones fetching her frozen body." Bartlett, feeling his earlier frustration vindicated by the Reverend's report, nodded grimly. "I left a stove plate on her step. It's still there." She'd rather trust that pile of mud. The social distance around Anyar grew. Women who once offered a hesitant smile now averted their eyes. Children were told not to wander too close to the widow's cabin, as if her particular brand of folly might be contagious. Her smokeless cabin was no longer just an oddity, it was a symbol of her stubborn refusal to belong. It was a silent judgment on their way of life, and they judged her for it in return. They saw her small woodpile and scoffed, never noticing that it barely seemed to shrink. They saw her gathering more dried grasses and river reeds, and they shook their heads, unaware that she was collecting slow-burning fuel for a fire that didn't need to rage. They were so certain in their knowledge of what survival looked like that they were completely blind to the evidence of it standing right before them. The cold deepened, settling into the bones of the land. The days grew short and grey, the sun a pale, distant coin in the sky. Nights were sharp with a killing frost. In the village, the rhythm of life changed. Mornings were a frantic ritual of stoking fires, the constant, hungry roar of the stoves a demanding presence in every home. The cost was measured in wood. The impressive stacks, built with the sweat of summer and autumn, were now shrinking at an alarming rate. The heat they produced was fierce but fleeting. It baked the area directly around the stove, leaving the corners of the rooms icy and drafty. The air was dry and filled with smoke that stung the eyes and throat. Life revolved around the feeding of the beast. But on the rise, a different kind of reality was taking shape. Anyazkotau had come to life. Each morning, she would feed it a small, carefully arranged bundle of sticks and dried reeds. The fire would burn brightly for an hour, maybe two, and then she would let it die down to embers. That was all. For the rest of the day and deep into the night, the massive earthen bench would release its captured warmth. It was not a blast of heat, but a steady, pervasive radiance that filled the small cabin from floor to ceiling. The air was clean, the warmth was gentle and enveloping. It was a heat you could lean against, a heat that felt like a lingering embrace. She could sit on the warm bench and mend her clothes. She could place a pot of stew on its surface and it would stay hot for hours. The very walls of the cabin seemed to have absorbed the warmth, turning the entire structure into a sanctuary against the encroaching cold. The first person to notice was a child, a young boy named Thomas, Bartlett's own son. Chasing a runaway dog, he stumbled near the wall of Anya's cabin. While the air around him was sharp enough to bite his cheeks raw, the space right beside the log wall was strangely mild. He pressed his mittened hand against the wood and felt a distinct, undeniable warmth. It wasn't hot, just not cold. It was the most peculiar thing. He ran home, bursting through the door into the stuffy, overheated air of his own kitchen. "Mama! The widow's cabin is warm on the outside." Sarah Bartlett, stirring a pot at her own scorching stove, gave him a distracted look. "Don't be silly, Thomas. It's freezing out. Now get away from that door." "But it is. I touched it." His father, stacking logs by the firebox, overheard and let out a short, humorless laugh. The boy's got a fine imagination. Warm on the outside. That's a good 1 inch. Thomas knew what he had felt, but he fell silent. The certainty of adults was a powerful thing, and it taught him to doubt his own senses. But the seed was planted. A few days later, a hunter tracking a fox through the thin layer of snow saw its trail lead directly to Anya's cabin. The track stopped near the base of the wall where the small vent pipe emerged. The fox had curled up there, in a small depression it had dug in the snow, seeking the faint current of lukewarm air that trickled out. The hunter paused, frowning. He knew animals had a sense for these things. They knew where to find shelter, where to find warmth. It made no sense, but like the boy's story, it was a small crack in the monolithic wall of the community's disbelief. They were small, quiet observations, easily dismissed, but they lingered in the back of the mind, inconsistencies in a story everyone thought they already knew. The sky had been a flat, metallic grey for 3 days, a heavy lid pressed down on the world. The old-timers felt it in their joints, a deep, aching barometer that never lied. A storm was coming. Not just a snowstorm, but a blizzard, a white monster that would descend from the mountains and try to scour the settlement from the face of the earth. When it came without warning. One moment there was a cold stillness, the next the world was gone, erased by a screaming, horizontal wall of white. The snow wasn't falling, it was attacking. It was a billion tiny, frozen knives driven by a wind that moaned like a dying beast. It clawed at the cabins, searching for any crack, any weakness. It forced its way through door jambs and window frames, leaving fine, powdery drifts on the floors inside. The temperature plummeted. It was a cold that felt personal, a cold that sought the very marrow in your bones. In Providence, every stove was pushed to its limit. Men made panicked, dangerous trips to their woodpiles, fighting through chest-high drifts, returning to their cabins gasping, their beards and eyebrows caked in ice. The roaring fires devoured the wood at a terrifying pace. Inside Bartlett's cabin, the mood was grim. The wind shrieked, and the walls groaned under the assault. Despite the stove burning so hot its sides glowed a dull red, the cold was winning. The floor was a sheet of ice away from the hearth, and frost was climbing the inside of the walls. His wife, Sarah, huddled under a pile of quilts with their son, Thomas, who had developed a dry, rasping cough. His small body was shivering uncontrollably. "More wood, John," Sarah pleaded, her voice thin with fear. "The fire is dying." Bartlett looked at the wood box. It was nearly empty. His main pile outside was huge, but it might as well have been on the moon. The 50 feet from his door to the woodpile was a treacherous, life-threatening journey. He had already made the trip twice, and each time it had been harder, the storm more furious. He knew he couldn't do it again before morning. Panic began to set in, a cold dread that was worse than the wind. He had been so sure, so prepared. He had followed all the rules. But the rules were failing. His fire was dying, and the blizzard was only growing stronger. His gaze went to the window, though all he could see was a swirling vortex of white. Out there, in that maelstrom, was Agniar's cabin. He pictured her inside, alone, with her pathetic little pile of sticks and her mud heap. A grim, terrible thought crossed his mind. He had been right. She was likely already gone, frozen in the dark. The thought brought him no satisfaction, only a hollow sense of shared doom. He had scoffed at her foolishness, but now his own wisdom was proving just as futile against the storm's raw power. The wind howled a fresh wave of fury, and the last of the logs in the stove crumbled into glowing embers, its heat already fading. The temperature in the room dropped noticeably. Thomas began to cry, a weak, frightened sound. The blizzard had them in its teeth, and it was not letting go. Sarah looked at her husband, her face a mask of desperation in the flickering lamplight. The last of the fire's glow was fading from the stove, and the room was succumbing to the predatory cold. Thomas's shivering had become more violent, his teeth chattering in a ceaseless, terrifying rhythm. "We have to do something," she whispered, her words barely audible over the shriek of the wind. "We can't just sit here and freeze." Bartlett stared at the dead stove, his mind a blank wall of despair. He had failed. His planning, his strength, his certainty, it had all amounted to nothing. They were trapped. Then, an impossible thought, a tiny flicker of memory, surfaced in his mind. Thomas, standing in the doorway, his cheeks red from the cold, insisting, "The widow's cabin is warm on the outside." It was madness. A child's fantasy. But what if it wasn't? What else was there? It was a sliver of a chance so thin it was transparent, but it was more than they had now. "The widow," he said, the name tasting like ash and humility in his mouth. Sarah's eyes widened. "John, no. If we are freezing with this stove, she must be." She couldn't finish the sentence. "I have to see," he said, his voice raw. "I have to know it wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about a terrible, gnawing uncertainty." He had been so sure of her fate, and now his own was in question. The dissonance was unbearable. He pulled on his heaviest coat, wrapped a scarf around his face until only his eyes were visible, and took a deep breath. "Keep him close," he told his wife, his voice muffled by the cloth. "I'll be back." Opening the door was like opening the gate to hell. The wind tore it from his grip, slamming it back against the wall. A blast of snow and ice flooded the room, and the lamp flickered wildly. He threw his shoulder against the door to close it and plunged into the white chaos. He couldn't see more than 3 feet in front of him. The snow was a solid, moving thing, a river of ice that tried to pull him down. He navigated by memory, his hands outstretched, feeling for the familiar shape of his neighbor's fence line. The cold was a physical blow, stealing his breath and burning his lungs. Every step was a battle. His mind screamed at him to turn back, that this was suicide. But the image of his son's shivering form pushed him forward. He thought of Anya's quiet, stubborn face. He had called her a fool. What did that make him, now? After what felt like an eternity, his hand brushed against the rough bark of a log wall. Her cabin. There was no light visible, no sound but the storm. He felt a profound sense of dread. He had been right after all. He had risked his life only to find a tomb. He stumbled along the wall, searching for the door. His frozen fingers found the latch. He pounded on the thick wood, his blows absorbed by the roar of the blizzard. "Anya," he yelled, his voice snatched away by the wind. "Anya!" He pounded again, with all his remaining strength, a frantic, desperate rhythm. He was about to give up, to surrender to the storm and his own foolishness, when he heard a sound from within, the scraping of a bolt. The door swung inward. The moment the door opened, the world changed. It was not a blast of frigid air that met him, but a wave of gentle, steady warmth. It flowed out of the cabin and wrapped around him, a physical presence in the raging storm. It was not the scorching, dry heat of an iron stove, but a soft, humid warmth that felt alive. It smelled of warm earth, of drying herbs, of life. He stumbled inside, his body numb and shaking, and pushed the door shut against the blizzard's fury. The roar of the wind was instantly muffled, replaced by a profound and enveloping silence. Anya stood before him, a simple shawl over her shoulders, her expression calm, unreadable. The cabin was bathed in the soft glow of a single candle, but the light seemed to come from everywhere. The air itself felt warm, thick, and nourishing. His eyes, slowly adjusting, took in the scene. The central bench, the kotow, was the source. It radiated a powerful, bone-deep heat that filled every corner of the small room. There was no fire visible, only a faint, rosy glow from the small firebox at its base, where a bed of embers pulsed gently. The surface of the bench was warm to the touch, and the very walls around him seemed to hold and reflect the heat. It was impossible. It defied every law of nature he knew. His gaze fell upon her woodpile, the same small, almost comical stack of branches he had scoffed at weeks ago. It was barely diminished. He looked from the tiny pile of fuel to the impossible, pervasive warmth of the cabin, and the foundations of his world cracked. All his pride, his certainty, his rigid adherence to the known ways, crumbled into dust. He was the fool. He had been the fool all along. He finally looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not a madwoman, but a purveyor of a wisdom so deep and simple he had been utterly blind to it. The strength drained from his legs and he sagged against the wall, the warmth of the log seeping into his frozen back. Tears he didn't know he had in him froze on his cheeks. "My boy," he rasped, his voice breaking. "My son is sick. We have no more wood. Our fire is out." He didn't ask for help. He couldn't. It was a confession, a surrender. He had come here half expecting to find her dead, a grim satisfaction in being proven right. Instead, he had found sanctuary, and in it, the full, crushing weight of his own ignorance. Anya looked at him, and for the first time, he saw not patience, but a deep, resonant empathy in her eyes. She did not say, "I told you so." She did not offer platitudes or rebukes. She simply nodded once, a gesture of profound and unconditional acceptance. "Bring them," she said. The two words were the purest form of grace he had ever known. He gathered his strength, opened the door back into the screaming white, and fought his way back to his family, carrying with him the impossible promise of warmth. The journey back with Sarah and Thomas was a desperate, slow-motion struggle against a monstrous force. Bartlett wrapped his son in every blanket they owned and carried him against his chest, shielding him with his own body. Sarah clung to his arm, her face a pale blur in the swirling snow. When they finally burst back into the warmth of Anya's cabin, they were half-frozen, spectral figures caked in ice. Sarah collapsed onto the floor, gasping, while Bartlett gently laid Thomas down on a pallet Anya had prepared near the warmest part of the earthen bench. The boy's shivering began to subside almost immediately as the steady, radiant heat soaked into his small frame. Sarah could only stare, her eyes wide with disbelief, at the source of the impossible warmth. She reached out a trembling hand and touched the surface of the clay bench. It was not hot, just deeply, wonderfully warm. She looked at Anya, her face a mixture of awe and shame. "How?" she whispered. Anya simply placed a cup of warm herbal tea in her hands. The news, somehow, traveled on the wind. Perhaps it was a brief lull in the storm, a moment when one neighbor, worried for Bartlett's family, dared to look out and saw the lamplit procession struggling through the snow. Or perhaps desperation has its own form of communication. Soon, there was another frantic pounding on the door. It was the Miller family, the Reverend himself looking humbled and broken, his wife clutching their infant daughter. Their wood was gone, their cabin an icebox. Anya let them in without a word, making space for them. An hour later, 2 more families arrived, their faces etched with the same fear and desperation. Anya's small cabin, once a symbol of her isolation, transformed into an ark. It became the heart of the community, the one place the blizzard could not touch. The room was crowded, filled with the quiet, huddled shapes of people who, only days before, had pitied and scorned its owner. They sat on the floor, they leaned against the walls, and they sat, shoulder to shoulder, on the long, winding bench of the kowtow. They were all drawn to it, touching its surface in wonder. The skeptics, the gossips, the proud patriarchs, they were all there, stripped of their certainty, reduced to a shared, basic need for warmth. They watched Anya as she moved quietly through the small space, checking on the children, offering what little food she had. Sometime before dawn, she opened the small door of the firebox. She didn't add a heavy log, but a few carefully chosen pieces of dried hardwood, no thicker than her wrist. The embers beneath glowed, and the wood caught fire with a clean, bright flame that produced almost no smoke. Bartlett, sitting on the bench, felt the deep, slow pulse of new heat begin its long journey beneath him. He finally found his voice. "All this," he said, his gesture taking in the entire warm, safe room. "From that?" Anya looked at the small, efficient fire, then back at him. She placed her hand on the warm clay beside him. "The iron stove eats the fire," she said, her voice soft but clear in the quiet room. This remembers it. The stone remembers the fire long after it is gone." The simple poetry of the explanation settled over the room. It was an ancient truth they had forgotten, or perhaps never known. They had put their faith in iron and brute force, in consuming the forest as fast as they could. She had put her faith in stone and earth and patience. And she had been right. The blizzard raged for 2 full days. In that time, Anya's cabin was a world unto itself, a pocket of warmth and life sealed against the howling chaos outside. The social structures of Providence dissolved within those 4 walls. Reverend Miller, the voice of moral authority, sat quietly on the floor, his daughter sleeping soundly in his lap for the first time in a day, his face a study in humbled contemplation. Bartlett, the de facto leader of the settlement's practical men, found himself deferring to Anya's quiet competence, watching as she managed her small store of resources with a wisdom that felt both ancient and revelatory. The children, recovering in the steady warmth, were unafraid, their parents' terror a distant memory. They were fascinated by the strange, warm snake in the middle of the room, occasionally patting its smooth, clay skin. The cabin, which had seemed so small from the outside, felt expansive, held together not by logs and mud, but by the shared miracle of their survival. On the morning of the 3rd day, they awoke to a new sound: silence. The wind had died. The world outside the door was still and muffled, buried under a deep blanket of white. When Bartlett opened the door, he was met with a breathtaking, blinding landscape. The snow was piled in massive drifts, sculpting the settlement into new, unrecognizable shapes. The sun was brilliant in a clean, blue sky, and the air was crystalline and cold, but no longer threatening. One by one, the families emerged from the cabin, blinking in the bright light, taking their first deep breaths of fresh, frigid air. They looked back at the small, smokeless cabin that had been their salvation. It looked exactly as it had before, unassuming, stubborn, different. But now, they saw it with new eyes. It was not a sign of madness, but a monument to a forgotten wisdom. They saw the tiny, almost untouched woodpile, and they understood. They thought of their own voracious stoves and their rapidly dwindling supplies, and a new, more profound understanding of the word efficiency took root. As they began the arduous task of digging themselves out, of checking on their own cold, silent homes, the feeling was unanimous. A shift had occurred, a fundamental reordering of their world. Later that day, after they had managed to restart their own fires with wood borrowed and shared, Bartlett and Reverend Miller returned to Anya's cabin. They did not bring advice or warnings. They stood at her door, their hats in their hands. "We came," Bartlett began, struggling to find the words, "to thank you. You saved us. You saved our children." Reverend Miller nodded, his face etched with a humility Bartlett had never seen on him before. "We were blind," the Reverend said. "We saw folly where there was wisdom. We ask for your forgiveness." Anya simply looked at them, her gaze accepting. There was no triumph in her eyes, no hint of "I told you so." There was only a quiet, steady calm. "There is nothing to forgive," she said. "The winter is hard. We help each other." Her use of the word "we" was not lost on them. In that moment, the wall her quiet refusal had built, and the wall their suspicion had reinforced, finally came down. She was no longer the strange widow. She was one of them. More than one of them. She was their teacher. When spring finally came, melting the great mountains of snow and breathing life back into the valley, a new kind of work began in Providence. It started with Bartlett. He appeared at Anya's door one morning, not with a piece of iron, but with a question. "Will you show me?" he asked, his voice full of a respect that bordered on reverence. "Will you teach me how to build the heart?" She agreed. And so began the great rebuilding. Bartlett, the community's most vocal skeptic, became her most dedicated student. He helped her gather the right kinds of stones from the river, learning to judge their density and shape. He learned the precise recipe for the clay and sand mortar, the feel of it in his hands. He worked with a convert's zeal, dismantling his own massive, inefficient chimney, stone by stone. The other men watched, at first with curiosity, then with a dawning understanding. They had all lived through the great blizzard. They all remembered the gnawing fear of a dying fire. They remembered the impossible, life-giving warmth of Anya's cabin. Soon, another man came to ask for her help, and then another. The summer was filled with the sounds of a different kind of construction. It was not the loud, hurried work of men fighting against nature, but the quiet, patient work of men learning to work with it. Anya moved between the cabins, a quiet instructor overseeing the building of each new kotal. She did not command, she guided. She would run her hand over a newly laid surface, suggesting a little more clay here, a smoother curve there. She taught them the logic of the slow path, the way to coax the heat from the smoke. She explained how the mass of the stone held the memory of the fire. The phrase became a piece of local law. The stone remembers. The cabins of Providence began to change from the inside out. The great, hungry iron stoves were removed, and in their place, these new earthen hearts grew. Each one was unique, shaped to the layout of the room, but all followed the same elegant, efficient principle. The women learned to cook on their warm surfaces, to dry laundry on racks above them, to appreciate a home without drafts and stinging smoke. The following autumn, as the aspens once again turned to gold, the settlement looked different. The skyline was changed. Fewer chimneys spewed thick plumes of smoke into the crisp air. The frantic, axe-swinging urgency of previous years was replaced by a more measured preparation. The woodpiles were smaller, more carefully curated. There was a quiet confidence in the air, the calm of a people who had learned a better way, who had faced their own ignorance and emerged wiser. Anya was no longer an outsider. She was the respected heart of the community, the woman who had taught them how to survive not by fighting the winter, but by understanding it. Her cabin, still standing on its rise, was no longer a symbol of isolation, but a testament to resilience. Years later, Travelers passing through the area would remark on the unusual construction of the cabins in that small valley, on the strange absence of smoke, and on the palpable sense of peace that seemed to settle in the air. The people of Providence would just smile and say that they had learned to build their homes around a warm heart, one that remembered the fire long after it was gone.